is a most fascinating material of living beings. It is alive and constantly changing and making adjustments based on the needs of the organism. Bone is a composite of two very different materials, each lending their mechanical properties. Take for example a fishing rod. The rod is made of fiberglass and resin. The fiberglass gives the rod flexibility, while the resin gives it its strength. Without the fiberglass, the rod would shatter, and without the resin, the rod would not have strength that it needs. Bone is very similar in that it contains organic material called osteoid, which gives it flexibility and tensile strength, and it also has inorganic material called mineral salts that give it its hardness and compressive strength. We'll take a look at some of the specifics of these materials in class, so if you wanted to read that section beforehand, go right ahead. The rest of Chapter 6 will be dealing with the nature of bone and the physiology behind it. We will look at how bone develops in the fetus, how it grows in the child, how it adapts in the adult, and how it heals. And we will also look at some pathology associated with bones. As I mentioned in part 1 of this video series, in the fetus, bone develops on either a cartilaginous or a fibrous framework, or template. Bone that forms from cartilage is called endochondral bone, and the process is called endochondral ossification. Bone that forms from a fibrous membrane is called membranous bone, and the process is called intramembranous ossification. So why start this process with a tissue other than bone? Well, the tissues that the body utilizes to begin this process are well suited to quick growth through mitosis, and you can imagine how limiting this would be working within a calcified matrix. The process of replacing these tissues with bone is a complicated one, and your book goes into great detail on it. I will highlight the important points in this video so that you can gain an understanding of this process without needing to memorize each step. Before we look specifically at bone development, it is important to understand how cartilage grows. Cartilage grows in two ways. Cartilage-forming cells within the perichondrium secrete new matrix, causing the cartilage to widen. This is known as appositional growth. Throughout life, bones will widen and thicken through appositional growth as well. Chondrocytes within lacunae will undergo mitosis and secrete new matrix, expanding the cartilage from within. This is called interstitial growth, and this will continue on until the skeleton stops growing late in the teens or early 20s. Around the 6th week of fetal development, most bones of the body will begin to ossify through the process of endochondral ossification. Mesenchyme develops into a framework of hyaline cartilage covered with a fibrous perichondrium. Let us recall that the mesenchyme develops from the mesoderm. It is an embryonic, undifferentiated tissue composed of multipotent stem cells. And multipotent means that these cells can differentiate into a number of different kinds of cells. The differentiation of these cells into specific cell types is determined by the external signals that the cells are receiving, and these signals are going to be carried through the bloodstream. What this picture from your textbook is showing is that in this example at about week 9, that the perichondrium has actually been replaced by periosteum and a bone collar has formed. What has happened here is that the perichondrium has stopped producing chondroblasts and started producing osteoblasts. Now what this picture is not showing you is that the reason why the changeover has taken place is due to the infiltration of blood vessels into the perichondrium, and the blood vessels are carrying the signals for the changeover. So what was once mitotically active chondroblasts have become mitotically active osteoblasts, and this begins the process of ossification. For new bone to form, cartilage must be broken down, and the areas where bone is forming are called ossification centers. These ossification centers will continue to grow until there are 1 or 2 thin lines of cartilage left, and these areas are called epiphyseal plates. These plates will continue the process of bone growth well into the late teens and even early 20s. Cartilage will also remain on the epiphyseal surfaces of long bones to become part of the joint complex. I've taken a fairly complex process and simplified it for you. I've also highlighted the high points, so make sure you know those. Just a point of clarification on terminology. When we use the term chondroblast or osteoblast, we're referring to mitotically active cells. These are immature cells that are used to either lay down new cartilage or new bone. The term osteocyte is going to be reserved for those mature cells that have been encased in their own matrix that are not actively mitotic but can become mitotic if needed. Intramembranous ossification occurs mainly in the skull bones and the clavicles. This is a less complicated but similar process to endochondral ossification. These bones tend to be flat bones with spongy trabeculae sandwiched in between two compact bony plates, and the spongy bone within the middle is referred to as diploi. So we've been looking at how bone develops in a fetus, but during infancy and youth, long bones will lengthen entirely by interstitial growth at the epiphyseal plates, and all bones will be widening by appositional growth. Now, the interstitial growth is not occurring actually in the bone itself, it's occurring in the cartilage of the epiphyseal plate. So it's the cartilage that's lengthening, but then it's being replaced by bone. So let's take a look and see how that happens. Longitudinal bone growth mimics the events of endochondral ossification. However, it is happening within a very confined space within the epiphyseal plates. Bone lengthens as the cartilage lengthens through interstitial growth. There are 5 distinct zones through this process, and the bone chases the cartilage. From the epiphysis end of the bone to the diaphysis end of the bone, the zones are a resting zone, a mitotic zone, a zone where the older cells are enlarging, a zone where the cartilage matrix is calcifying and the cells are dying, and a zone of ossification. We can see that ossification is moving toward the epiphysis, and that the epiphysis would be moving away from the diaphysis because of the lengthening of the cartilage. So bone is chasing the cartilage and will one day catch up and overtake it, and eventually the plates will close, leaving behind only a thin line that will be visible on X-ray as the epiphyseal line. The process of bone remodeling is a lifelong process and is controlled by 2 factors: local mechanical stresses placed on the bone and the metabolic needs of the body. Bone serves as a reservoir for calcium and phosphate ions, which are held in the hydroxyapatite crystals. Bone will absorb or release these ions as needed. This process is under hormonal control, the most important being the parathyroid hormone, which is secreted by the parathyroid gland. This hormone helps to regulate the level of calcium in the blood. Calcium is required for many important physiological processes, and the consequences of too little or too much calcium can be harmful and have very dramatic consequences. If blood calcium levels are too low, parathyroid hormone will be released and will stimulate osteoclasts to break down bone and release the calcium. The second determining factor in the processes that control bone remodeling is the mechanical stresses that are placed on the bone. Wolff's law states that the architecture of a bone is determined by the mechanical stresses placed upon it. The specific stresses that we're talking about would be the load of weight bearing from the effect of gravity and muscular pull. And loading of a long bone would tend to bend a long bone, which causes compression on one side and stretching on the other. So if we look at a long bone, it would tend to be thickest midway through its diaphysis and hollow in the middle. Wolff's Law is evident when we compare the bones of the sedentary versus the athletic, young person versus the elderly, and fetal bones versus an older child's bones. As we age and demands on the bones change, the way the bones look will also change. Bone remodeling is a dance between bone deposition and bone resorption, and is explained very nicely in your required video on this topic. We'll be discussing some of the details in class, along with the topic of bone repair, so please read these sections in your text. Our final topic for this video is bone repair. Included in bone repair is fracture classification and fracture treatment and repair. In this course, we will focus on and test you on repair. However, please be aware of the terminology in the classification of fractures and the treatment of fractures, because this information will be relevant for you in the future. So there are 4 stages in the healing of bone fracture, and instead of taking you through those 4 stages, I'll just have you read the book because the book describes them very nicely, and then we will discuss them further in class. So go ahead and take a look at that in your textbook. And we are finished up for this video. I'll see you in class.